Thank you all for joining us once again. Shavua Tov, Gemara Chasima Tova. Rabbi Dr. Rosensweig really needs no introduction. He's been the scholar in residence at the Fifth Avenue Synagogue for 20 plus years. Am I correct?
Sounds right.
Yes.
The number's a
yes.
little scary, but
And
Yes.
he's inspired countless Talmidim in the yeshiva and in the shul and the various classes he gives in the city. He's an outstanding Talmid Chacham. It's a great honor, a true privilege for us to have him as a scholar in residence in Fifth Avenue Synagogue. And aside from his weekly Gemara shir he gives throughout the year, which Jacob was just speaking about, there's a tradition that before the holidays, Rabbi Rosensweig gives a lecture as well related to the upcoming holiday. And we're in the shadow of Yom Kippur, the holy day of Yom Kippur, and no better way to prepare for the holy day of Yom Kippur through Tamatara, through Torah study. I want to thank Rabbi Rosensweig for joining us this evening. He has a quite busy schedule, and just conclude by wishing him and his entire family a healthy, successful year, a year in which he is mashpia on many, many Talmidim in good health, him and his entire family.
thank you very, very much.
Man.
First of all, just a commercial announcement, as we discussed before. Our Gemara shir is going to be resuming, what did we just say? October the 5th, right?
Yeah, the first Tuesday in October.
The first Tuesday in October, which is the first Tuesday after Yom Tov. That's Tuesday, October 5th. We'll be resuming, and we'll be studying this year we'll start with the first chapter in Baba Basra, which deals with actually the laws of neighbors, in a way, people who live together in a community, and their obligations towards one another to keep each other protected, to respect each other's rights. Very timely topic. All Torah topics are timely topics, but really the first Mishnah in Baba Basra speaks about the mutual requirements that two neighbors have to protect each other's privacy. A very fascinating topic, and that's what we'll be beginning with, and then we'll see where it takes us. So that's Tuesday, October 5th, beginning at 7:30, and I think we're going to be continuing on Zoom for now. That seems to be the plan, and we look forward to that. It's a very, let's say, fascinating topics, and we always have very spirited exchanges in the shir that we're looking forward to as well. Okay. For this evening, in preparation, for Yom Kippur, I thought we would zero in on one particular issue, which I think, when properly understood and evaluated, really highlights several overlapping themes or motifs that are very singular about Yom Kippur. So this evening, we're going to speak about the concept of tahara, of purity on Yom Kippur. Let me start by speaking about a minhag, and I want to kind of analyze that minhag. Are there marmakomos, by the way? I sent in a couple of hours ago. Do people have marmakomos or not? Do we know?
Yes, I believe they were sent out, yes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to assume that people have them and that they are accessible. Okay. So the Gaonim already had the tradition that people used to be tovel in a mikvah. They used to immerse themselves in a mikvah in advance of Yom Kippur. And the basis for this minhag is somewhat mysterious. It doesn't appear at all in the Talmud. Not everybody does it, frankly. And the question is, what is the basis for it, number one? And the stakes on that question were considerably raised by Reb Sadia Gaon, one of the great Gaonic authorities, who suggested that this is not only a proper minhag, proper practice, but one which should also require a bracha. And we're not, quick to make brachos for no reason. There's a problem making a bracha levatala, a bracha which isn't called for, could be a biblical violation according to some. At minimum, it's a rabbinic violation. We avoid many brachos because of the problem of bracha levatala. So the idea that you might make a bracha on Tefila, on immersing yourself in a mikvah in advance of Yom Kippur, was a controversial view of Reb Saadia Gaon, and it elicited a very sharp response. So I want to begin with the citation of that minhag and the Rosh's response to it, and then I want to spend, a little bit of time trying to analyze what might be the foundation of the minhag, whether we do it or not, and whether we make a bracha on it or not. Most people certainly do not make a bracha. We paskin like the Rosh. But the view of Reb Saadia Gaon is a respected view, and therefore it needs to be understood. And even if you don't make a bracha, for those who do this, who have this tradition, many people do, many people don't. But even if you don't, it's important to understand what the basis of it is. What insight can we glean from this discussion about the upcoming holiday of Yom Kippur?
What bracha would you make, Rabbi? What bracha would you make?
Al HaTefila. Actually, the last topic that we discussed in Masechet Psachim, when we adjourned at the end of June, was actually the topic of making a bracha in the advance of performing a mitzvah. If you recall, Kol HaMitzvos Mevarchen Aleim Over L'Asiyasan. We make a bracha before we perform a mitzvah. And the Gemara there in Psachim and Avzayin Rebeis says that there originally thought there were two exceptions. In the end, concludes there's only one exception, and that is Tefila. When you immerse yourself in a mikvah, then you make a bracha after rather than before. In the case of Gerus and in the case of Balkari, we'll discuss both of those in a minute, because you can't make the bracha in advance. You're not in a state in which you're fit to make the bracha. But the bracha would be Asher Kedishanu B'mitzvot Tzivanu, let's say, probably Al HaTefila. And we'll see in a moment, the Reb Saadia Gaon suggested to make that bracha as well. So look here on page 1, you'll see it says Rosh Masechet Yoma, Perek Ches Siman Chav Daled. Go about halfway down the page, and you'll see it says V'noagu litbol be'erev Yom Kippurim. Everybody have that? This is 7 lines up before the piece ends. Or if you want to go the other way, about 10 lines into the piece, starting from the beginning of the sentence. V'noagu litbol be'erev Yom Kippurim. There's a minhag, a tradition, to immerse oneself in the mikvah Erev Yom Kippur. The Rav Amram, what is one of the earliest Gaonim, the siddur that we have, by the way, is heavily influenced by the siddur of Rav Amram Gaon. He had probably the earliest intact siddur that we have. So Rav Amram, Tovel Adam b'Sheva Shos u'mispalal Tfilas Mincha. The tradition was that a person should go to the mikvah before he davens Mincha Erev Yom Kippur, and then from there you go and you daven Mincha. V'amar Rav Saadia, and this is the Chiddush that I mentioned before, Ba'aliyaso militbal, when he arises, meaning he ascends, literally and figuratively, from the tefillah in the mikvah, Nevarech ala tefillah. He makes a bracha on the tefillah. The Rosh, commenting on this, says, the ein dvar of nirim bazeh. This I don't agree with him on this matter. Shalom atzinu bashas remez l'tefillah zu. We don't find in the entire Talmud any rhyme or any hint that there is such a immersion in the mikvah. The ein lo yesod neviim v'lo minhag neviim. It doesn't have a basis in the prophets. It's not a tradition that we know from the Nevi'im. In other words, even if it wasn't in the Talmud, you would think that it would be, mentioned as some sort of a practice, if not a requirement, but it doesn't appear anywhere. And he goes on to say, Velo adifa me arava. It's not any better than an arava. In fact, it's less than an arava, because there is a known minhag that the Talmud records, Minhag Anavim, that they used to beat the arava, the Hoshanos, Damale chavit, below barich. They used to say that, when you do chibut arava on Sukkot, that you do it, but you shouldn't make a bracha. Kasavar minhag neviim, because they said it's only a practice, it's not an obligation, and ein mevarchin ala minhag. So basically, we have a very interesting discussion. Rav Amram Gon suggests that in advance of Mincha Erev Yom Kippur, you should be Tovel. Rav Sadia Gon takes it one notch up and says, not only that, you should make a bracha as well. And the Rosh says, we don't find this entire practice in the Talmud. You don't even see it as a minhag neviim. Even if it was a minhag, ein mevarchin ala minhag. You don't make a bracha on a minhag. V'im mishum da'am Rabbi Yitzchak, lest you say that the reasoning is another halacha. Rabbi Yitzchak is quoted in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Tezayin and Beis, as saying, Chayiv Adam letaher atzmo beregel. That in advance of every regel, a person is obligated to make sure that he's in a state of ritual purity. Chayiv Adam letaher atzmo beregel. So maybe that's the reason that you have the obligation here to be mistaher in advance of Yom Kippur. Says the Rosh, no.
But that would be for every regel, right? Not just Yom Kippur.
Right. So number one, that would be for every regel, and we don't find that you make a bracha in advance of every regel. But your point is well taken. But you could take it also in the other direction. Is Yom Kippur a regel?
Right.
Regel has a very specific meaning. Regel means that it is one of the Gimel Regalim, where there was an obligation for every Jew, every male at least, to ascend to the Beis HaMikdash, right, and to bring korbanos for the regel. But there's no such obligation for Yom Kippur. So number one, we should find this practice of making a bracha for Tefila in every regel. And number two, this isn't even a regel. Now, the idea that it's not a regel is something that's discussed particularly by the Shagas Aryeh. It says the whole thing shouldn't apply, but we'll get to it. In any case, the Rosh doesn't reject it for that reason, either of those reasons, interestingly. Instead, he says, Hainu l'tar atzmo mikol tumos, da'afilu mitumas meis, ulahazos olav gimel v'zayin, but v'ha'idna ein lanu ta'aros. V'kivin she'ein balekarian tovlin kol hashana kula, gam ein chova l'tfila zu, ve'ein levarech aleha. He says the reason, this is assumption that the Rosh makes, which we'll get back to, the reason that you're supposed to purify yourself in advance of every regel is because you want to neutralize tumah, so that you can be osek b'taharos. But we don't have that anymore. We don't have the ability, to completely become tahar. We don't have, taharos anymore. So what would be the point? The Rab Sadia Gon is speaking, in the medieval period when there weren't these things already. The issue that the Rosh and the Gonim are debating is applicable, to the 12th century, earlier the 9th century, and it's applicable in the 22nd century. So if the reason is because you have to be, able, to eat taharos, or kudshim, that certainly doesn't apply, says the Rosh. Moreover, he says, there's another kind of tefillah that's called the tefillah of a balkari. Tefillah of a balkari, without going into details, is a consequence. If a person has, if a male has a certain kind of emission that reflects, his, I guess, more lighthearted, orientation, and he had, a seminal emission, as a result. That's called keri. So that individual has to be mistar. He has to immerse himself into a mikvah. That was a takana of Ezra, before he engages in Tefila or in Tamatara. At a certain point in history, that was instituted, and at another point in history, that was abandoned because it just became too difficult to require it. So the Rosh, we're going to discuss this more in a minute, the Rosh says, Kivin she'ein bale kerian tovlin kol hashana kula, since we no longer have that institution, gam ein chova l'tefila zu. So basically, he has rejected that the tefillah is based on Rabbi Yitzchak, chayav adam l'taharas hatzum b'regel. He's rejected that it is connected to the principle of balkari, somebody whose behavior, frivolous behavior, led him to a state of tumah. He says neither of these things should apply, and therefore the whole minhag maybe, is not very compelling, and certainly ein levarech aleha. You certainly shouldn't be making a bracha on it. Ella shenagu ha'olam l'taher atzman mikari l'tfilas Yom Kippurim. People do have the minhag to immerse themselves to neutralize this problem of carry in advance of Yom Kippur. And Samchu Midrash Tanchuma b'Parshas V'Eschanon b'Yom Kippurim sheim nikiyim kamalache asharis. That Klal Yisrael is supposed to be pure, right? On Yom Kippur, they're supposed to be able to compete with the malachim themselves. And therefore, what emerges is that the Rosh endorses this minhag as a practice based on the principle of being nikiyim, like malachim, but he certainly does not accept the more ambitious formulation of it, in which case it is either obligatory or worthy of a bracha. And indeed, if you look at the tour, 1 second, the tour in Orach Chaim, the tour was the work and collected halacha after the Rambam, and of course in advance of the Shulchan Aruch. The author of the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo, wrote a perush on the perush on the tour called the Beis Yosef. The tour was the son of the Rosh. So, he weighs in on this topic, and you can imagine that his view is not, very different from his father's. He quotes his father. This is in Siman Taf Reish Vav, Sif Daled. V'nogu litval be'erev Yom Kippurim. The practice is to do tefillah on Erev Yom Kippur. Amar of Amram tovel adam b'shal shvius u'mitzpal mincha. Amar of Sadja baliyasa melitval mebarech ala tefillah. Because of Adoni Avi Harash, he says, my master and father, the Rosh, wrote, Ein dvarav nirim bazeh. Shalom batzina b'talmud rebens l'tefillah zu ve'en el yisod neviim v'lo minhag neviim. He basically quotes the words of the Rosh, and he concludes the sum that endorsing the practice without the bracha. The samcha midrash shal pirkei Rabbi Lazar shenikim kamalache ashares b'yom Kippur. That we should be, as pure as the malachim, on Yom Kippur. That is the view as quoted in the Torah based on the Psak of the Rosh. The Shulchan Aruch weighs in on this as well, not as clear, but based on this basic idea. The Shulchan Aruch actually says, Yochol litvol v'lilkos masai sheyirtza rakshi yakodem alayla. There's no requirement to do the tefillah necessarily before mincha, according to the Shulchan Aruch, but he could do it. He doesn't say that it's obligatory. Again, many people do not have the practice, but it said if you're going to do tefillah, you should do it whenever you want, as long as you do it prior to the evening. The eina mavarech ala tefillah. He just says very succinctly that we paskin like the Rosh. You don't make a bracha. Haga ve'ein tzarich, the Rama adds litbal rak pamachas below vidui mishum keri, that you do it mishum keri. The huadin, you could do other things, to substitute for it as well. Okay, so basically this is nifsak and Shulchan Aruch that there is such a minhag. It can be done in a very flexible way, but it might be connected to carry. We're not really sure what it is connected to. Okay. So what I'd like to do is just examine, some of these themes, and especially to try to justify the position of Reb Sajikon. But let me make it clear: not that you should make a bracha on the Tefila, but to understand why Reb Sajikon thought this was important enough. The questions that the Rush raises are sufficiently problematic that we need to understand Reb Sajikon. Reb Sajikon was a major pillar in the world of halacha. His position cannot simply be ignored. So understanding his perspective on the nature of Yom Kippur is something which is valuable, even if in practice we don't implement his more radical psak that you also make a bracha on the tefillah. So the first thing to note is what the Rosh agrees to. And that is this idea of competing with malachim on the day of Yom Kippur. I don't want to expand too much on that, but there is a whole literature and a strong foundation that reinforces this idea. The Gemara in Masechet Shabbos and Daf Peches Amud Beis explains that when the Torah was given on Har Sinai, that the Malachim were particularly unhappy about it. They felt the Torah should have been given to them rather than to flawed man. And essentially, the Rabbanu Shalom's response to them, very, very well known, very celebrated, is that man's greatness is also in his humanity and in his capacity, to be flawed, but even greater capacity to overcome his flaws. And the Gemara goes on to say that, the Rabbanu Shalom said to the Malachi Hashares, you think the Torah should be for you? Does lo sigzal apply to malachim? Does lo sirtzach apply to malachim? Does lo sachmod and lo sisnas achicha b'vavecha apply to malachim? Clearly, the Torah is targeted to human beings. But the idea of the Gemara is not that, the content of the Torah, is particularly relevant to human beings and less so to malachim. It's that the Torah is a way of spiritualizing, upgrading, uplifting mankind. And that, again, man's, challenged state is precisely what makes the Torah, really the foundation, of the world. If notwithstanding his humanity, the fact that he is Afram and Adama, Vayitzar Hashem Elokim, with two yuds, Yetzer Hara, V'Yetzer Tov. If he can channel, his humanity, and not only a way that doesn't drag him down and limit him, but in a way that he's able to overcome and override, and achieve spiritual greatness, notwithstanding, his nature, and that's the goal of really what one is supposed to be striving for in a Torah life. Lo nitna Torah el letzaref es habrios. Then ultimately, man is greater than malachim. So, what does it mean when we say that on Yom Kippur we rival malachim? Right? According to some views, we shout out, Baruch Shem Kivod Malchuso Le'olam Va'ed in the in the context of Shema. Normally we're silent, and on this one day we scream it out. Somehow that is in imitation of the Malachim. We stand a lot on the day of Yom Kippur because Malachim stand. Of course, we abstain from eating, from drinking. We kind of suppress aspects of our, humanity on Yom Kippur to rival Malachim. But the point is, being Nikiyim Kemalachim on Yom Kippur, notwithstanding the fact that we, have the urge, to succumb to our, human foibles, that ability elevates us beyond the Malachim. If we can rival the Malachim with the appetites and also with the aptitude to overcome those appetites of man, then in the end of the day, we emerge, as truly worthy recipients, of the Torah. And that's certainly what the Gemara meant in Masachet Shabbos. Yom Kippur is the day of the year in which the ability to rise to that occasion, to manifest our pure spirituality, is accomplished. And again, as I've said many other years, the idea is not, to achieve or attain this high level on Yom Kippur, and then to lapse, back, right afterwards. So I can do it. The idea is to demonstrate your capacity to rival Malachim, notwithstanding, right, the appetites of a human being, which makes you greater, and to kind of, take that victory and to let that animate, right, the other ways of Avodas Hashem, that specifically invoke, the human, dimension and aspect. So that Yom Kippur is not, just the zenith of the apex of our achieving spirituality. It's the loyalty test, if you will. It's the litmus test of, who we really are, what our purpose really is, what we're capable of, which in turn refines and redefines the way that we behave all year round. That's how I like to explain. Torah uses the expression 3 different times regarding Yom Kippur, achas bashana. And of course, the simple pshat is that it's once a year. It happens once a year. But what the Torah is trying to say, Torah is certainly not only telling us that it's one day a year, it's telling us it's a singular day, and it's a day for the year, meaning the entire year revolves around this day, and this day is the best investment you can make in the rest of the year. So one way we do that is by rivaling the Malach. According to the Rosh, this doesn't occasion a bracha, but it does justify, the basic minhag. And as such, it's not so far-fetched to think that Reb Sajagon may have, considered, this accomplishment and this symbolic focus of Niu Nikiyim Kamalachim even sufficient to require bracha itself, although it's not mentioned in the Talmud and so on. But let's take it a step further. The Darkei Moshe, is the commentary of the Ramah. Ramah wrote on the Shulchan Aruch, of course, and he is the authority of Ashkenaz in the Shulchan Aruch. But the Darkei Moshe, before he did that, wrote a Perush on the Tur, just like the Beis Yosef wrote a Perush on the Tur. In his Perush on the Tur, he quotes the view of the Yesh Omrim, who explain that the Tefila here has a different basis. So far we've discussed, Yiu Nikiyim Kamalachim, and I've tried to expand that and to suggest that it has a wider meaning. The Ramah says, the Yesh Omrim Tam Tefila Zu, Lav Mishum Keri, El Mishum Dahava Keger HaMizgayer the Tzarech Tefila. A very remarkable suggestion. It may be the reason that we're Tovel on Erev Yom Kippur is because a ger is Tovel in the process of his gear. Of course, the question is, Ma'inyan Shmita Eitzel Har Sinai, right? What does a ger hamizgayer have to do with Yom Kippur? Some of the Achronim suggest, and Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal suggested this as well, that perhaps this is based on, a certain perspective, in Hilchos Tshuva itself. Rambam in Hilchos Tshuva Perek Beis Halacha Daled discusses, the ambition and the effect of tshuva. He says in a very famous passage, Midarkei HaTshuva, right? It's the methodology of tshuva. Lios hashav tzoek tamid lefnei Hashem bebechi ubetachnunim. where the person who's doing tshuva is in a constant state of crying or shrieking, into tears and tfilos. The osa tzedakah kifi kocho, and he makes extraordinary efforts, to be generous by giving tzedakah. Umisrache karbe min hadavar shechatabo, and he distances himself exceedingly from his chatoim. And then he adds umishane shemo, and he changes his name. Klomar, right? Shani acher ve'eni osa ish she'asa osan hamasim. I'm no longer the same person. I have a personal transformation or makeover. Umishane masav kulan latova uladera chishara. The word kulan seems superfluous, but what he's saying is, all of his actions, because he's not tinkering, basically. He's completely transforming. V'gola mimikomo, shegolas mechaperes avon, shegoremes lichana, v'lios anav, v'shafel ruach. So, of course, this is something that is said about Darkei HaTshuva in general. The Rambam, of course, very famously, a few halachos later, says, Aval bisha tshuva v'atza'aka yafa liolam, basar yamim sheben Rosh Hashanah, v'yom Kippur mu yafa biyoser miyad himiskabelas, shenemar dirshu Hashem b'himatzo, kira'u biyoso karov. Based on the Gemara in Masachet Rosh Hashanah, that even though typically the Rabbanu Shalom, is kind of hostage to the tfilos only of the tzibor, but not of the yachid, but when it comes to the tkufa, the period between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, every yachid is treated like a tzibur. In other words, these are propitious days of tshuva, right? Basar yamim sheben Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur mu yafe biyoser, and not just more conducive, but also more effective and of a different quality. Umiyad himiskabelas. And of course, this is true for Aseret Yemei Teshuva, and it's even more true for Yom Kippur. In Halacha Zayin, the Rambam says, Yom Kippurim huzman tshuva lekol yachid ulerabim. It's a time of tshuva for individuals and for the community. V'ukeitz mechila uslicha liyisrael. It's the time for mechila and slicha for Klal Yisrael. Lefika chayavin hakol lasos tshuva ulizvados b'Yom Kippur. It's the only place in Hilchos Tshuva where the Rambam actually speaks of an obligation to do tshuva. A very remarkable thing, almost neglected by the Mefarshim, this point. Typically, the Rambam's view is when you do tshuva, the obligation is to do vidui. That's well known. It's not well known that there's one exception, and that is regarding Yom Kippur, where the Rambam says there's an obligation to initiate tshuva. So what I'm trying to say is, if midarkei hatshuva, in its heights, includes mishana shemo, klomar eni osa isha osa mamasim, umishane kol masav kulan latova. If that transformative perspective is true generally, then it's even more true on Yom Kippur. Let me go a step further, and this is going to overlap with some other things that we're going to suggest. The tshuva of Yom Kippur is fundamentally different than the tshuva that takes place typically all year round. All year round, tshuva is a response to chet. And the focus of tshuva is the neutralization of that chet. If you look at the very beginning of the Rambam, Nichos Tshuva, Perek Aleph, Halacha Aleph, that's what he focuses on. When a person is chote, his obligation to do vidui in the context of tshuva, to neutralize that sin, etc. But Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, is a day in the calendar. Meaning, he didn't particularly sin more on the 9th, of Tishrei, or on the last day of Elul, than any other time. It's the Zman of Tshuva. It's the holiday of Tshuva, in a way. Or it's the holiday of Din, and therefore the holiday of Tshuva. That's what the Rambam means when he says it's Zman Kates Mechila Uslicha right? Liyachid ularabim. On that day, there can be two perspectives. One is each individual chet, you transgressed and you have to neutralize your chet. You have 100 of them, you have 100 obligations. You have, 15 of them, you have 15. You have to look at your record. And certainly that is part of it. There's no question about it. Being mefashfesh b'masecha, right? Undergoing personal introspection, examining what you did. Vidui includes, being mefarei tesachet, etc. However, there's another aspect of Yom Kippur, and that's, even primary. And that is you are not necessarily focusing primarily on individual chataim, because the date in the calendar. What you are mostly doing is re-examining your religious personality, who you are, and whether you're worthy. So, and for that reason, the vidui, for example, of Yom Kippur is simply aval anachnu chatan, says the Rambam. Not all the details that you have in individual vidui of individual chataim. Why? Because you're taking a holistic, instead of a compartmentalized approach. You're trying to be worthy of being omed lifnei Hashem on Yom Kippur. That's exactly what the Torah speaks about, right? Ki bayom hazeh yichaper aleichem l'taher eschem, right? Mikol chatosechem lifnei Hashem titaru. So, from that point of view, the focus on Yom Kippur is on all chataim, because it's not on any individual one, it's really on the religious personality. That's why we have so many al-chets. Spoken in the past about this as well. You don't have the luxury of saying only the al-chets that apply to you. It's a very long list, and some of the things don't apply. I'm guessing that everyone on the list applies to somebody at some time, but not all of the list ever applies to any particular person. So why can't you just cherry pick? Say the al-chets that apply to you. If you want, be machmir. If you're not sure, include some of those as well. You could shorten the tefillah a little bit. It might interfere. I don't know if the chazan is on the call or on the webinar or not, but it might interfere with some of the, the musical, composition. But in the end of the day, we could cut out half the al-chets or more. But it's not just that. There's a debate in the Gemara whether or not the averos that you did vidui on and kapara and shuva on in previous years, do we mention them as well? The Rambam paskins that we do. Why are we mentioning old, already neutralized sins? But the answer is, in both cases, because as much as we also care about individual chataim, the bigger focus and concern on Yom Kippur, on the Yom Noraim in general, is on the Gavra HaChote, and really his, stature as a legitimate spiritual personality, as somebody who can, compete with and even, override the stature of Malachim. So if there's a din of Klomar, Eini osa isha asa osam hamasim, umeshana shemo, umasav hatovim, right, kulam, if there's an aspect of refashioning, who you are, acquiring, a new identity, having a complete spiritual makeover, if there's that aspect of Darkei HaTshuva generally, even when the focus and the inspiration is individual chataim, then kol shekain, certainly that is the case in the Yom Noraim and advance of Yom Kippur, when the inclination anyways to focus holistically on the totality of the individual. So if that's the case, then we can understand very well this position that the Darkei Moshe is quoting, which is that the Tefila that we undergo is perhaps the Tefila of Geros. What is a ger? Gerus is predicated on the ability of an individual to refashion, to remake his personality. What is it that Chazal say about a ger? Ger shenizgayer kekatan shenolad dami. It's like he's born anew. In the case of ger, we mean it literally, right? The people that he was previously related to, he's no longer halachically connected with. And, his previous life, all things being equal in most areas, there are some exceptions, is kekatan shenola dami, right? It's not his past anymore. It belonged to some other individual. So if Tefila of Gerus is the paradigm for Tefila of Yom Kippur, then what we are accentuating, is not only the centrality of Teshuva on Yom Kippur, but the particular character of Teshuva Yom Kippur, which even more than the regular Midarkei HaTeshuva emphasizes this idea of Mishana Shemo, Eini Osa Ha'ish, I'm not the same person who did those actions. The Gemara says that Teshuva Me'ahava refashions Chata'im. If you do Teshuva out of love of the Ribono Shel Olam, then you can make Chata'im into Schuyos, into merits. If you do it out of Yira, out of fear of God, you could take Zdonos, intentional Averos, and turn them into the status of unintentional Averos. It's obviously less remarkable than making them into Schuyos. But both of these are not just slogans. They need to be understood. How do you reach back into the past, right, and turn a negative, into less of a negative or even into a positive? And the more you focus on the Avera itself alone and neutralizing it, the more impossible that seems to be. But if it's about the relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam in a bigger way, which begins in Chodesh Elul, Ani L'Dodi V'Dodi Li, if the focus this time of the year on Teshuva, because it's the calendar that brings it about, is about your relationship with Hashem and being worthy of being in his presence, having a bond and a relationship with him. So then sometimes the sense of alienation that you feel when you are distant can be a catalyst, right, to greater appreciation and to renewing the relationship with greater passion, greater ardor, and greater commitment. That's what we mean when we speak about Averos, which are transformed from Zdonos to Shkogos, from Shkogos to Schuyos. But that is on the level of Eini Osa Isha Asa Osa Mamasim, mostly. It's about refashioning the relationship and the persona, not just, focusing on the action itself. So that is one perspective. Whether that's the idea behind Reb Saadia Gaon's actual bracha, I don't know. But either way, I think it's a very interesting perspective. I think there's a second perspective as well. And that relates to Balkari. Mentioned before that in the discussion of the Rush, the idea, the paradigm of Tevilas Balkari, the Tefillah of somebody who's frivolous, improper behavior, put him in a state of ritual impurity, and the need for him to immerse in a mikvah, right, prior to resuming Tefila and Tamatara, that is something which does seem to be connected to this particular minhag. And if you look at Shulchan Aruch, it seems, that way as well. So the question, however, is that, as the Rush pointed out, we don't do this anymore. There's no Tfilas Keri Bizmanenu. You can daven and you can learn, without having to undergo that immersion. So why all of a sudden, when it comes to Yom Kippur, would there be this issue and this concern? So there's a very interesting tshuva of the Avnei Nezer. If you have the Mar Makomas in front of you, it's on, I believe, the last page, or the second, I'm sorry, page 3, where the Avnei Nezer addresses the question of Rab Sadigon and the Rosh. It says, Shut Avnei Nezer Chelik Archaim Simin Tafnin Beis, Bedin Tvilas Erev Yom Kippur. So he starts off by quoting the problem. Betur Archaim Simin Tafreish Vav, Kasav Rab Sadigon Baliaso, Militbol, Amar Baliaso, Militbol, Erev Yom Kippur Mevarach Ala Tefila. Rab Sadigon said that when you emerge from the mikvah, you should make a bracha on the Tefila. Kasav Adon Avi Arash, Ein Dvar Nirim Bazeh, Velo Adifa Me'arava. Rinan Chabit Velabarach, Dein Ela Minhag, Yuyin Shamete. Ach, B'Sefer Tanya Rabasi, Kasav Barach. The Avnei Nezer points out it wasn't just Rab Sadigon. He had adherents who, or contemporaries, who also thought you'd make a bracha on this tefillah. So he says a very remarkable idea. Ubi yishuv kushas harash nira, says the Avnei Nezer, dinei b'halal de Rashkodesh and b'varchen after Minhag. The kosvu lechalek de shani arava de netila bialma, bilav minhag neviim lo yiklu. Mashein kein halal af below Minhaga lo gora mikori batorah. Shaper mevarchen ala minhag. This is based on the Balei Tosas. Balei Tosas point out, do you make a bracha on a minhag or not? The Gemara says when it comes to chibur arava, banging the arava, you don't make a bracha because it's just a minhag. But reciting Halal on Rashkodesh and on Chol HaMoed Pesach is also only a minhag. And that's the debate, the Chachmei Sfarad and Chachmei Ashkenaz. Chachmei Ashkenaz, the Minhag Ashkenaz, is that we do make a bracha. Sfardim do not, but Ashkenazim do make a bracha on Halal and Rosh Chodesh. What's the difference between the Minhag of Halal and Rosh Chodesh and the Minhag of Chibur Arava? Says the Balei Tosas, the difference is as follows. Chibur Arava is a standalone Minhag. Saying Halal on Rosh Chodesh, the timing is the minhag. But the concept of saying Halal is sometimes obligatory, even in Torah. The idea of saying Halal is understandable to anybody. You're saying Shavach V'Hodah, you're singing the praises of the Rabbanu Shalom. What could be wrong with that? So, when you decide to expand and to say Halal on Rosh Chodesh or on Chol HaMoed, there may not be a chiyuv, but there's always a kiyum, a mitzvah. You're always accomplishing something. You're formulating divrei shevach of the Rabbanu Shalom. So, because it's a fulfillment of a mitzvah, you accomplish something, you make a bracha. What does that have to do with here? So he goes on to say a very fascinating thing. V'hu adin tfilas keri. The mefurish gemar brachos mishun debal keri eino be'ema shaba machmas kalos rosh. Ubevade af belota kanas Ezra milsar abasa lilmod biyira begilui vegilu bira adaksiv. Koshkein tfila shu kemedaber lifnei amelach. Ach mikol makom mayamuta lilmo below tfila gam kein Ezra tikin she asur. Lilmodu l'spala below tefila, ubitlu l'tfilusa, mishum bittul peri v'rivya, ubittul Tamatara. Uv'yom Kippurim miminaga sheyachiyuv litbol l'Torah u'letfila. Akiva the tefila zu af below minhag mitzvah gedola, doma l'kriyas halal b'rosh chodesh. It takes somebody like the Avnei Nezer, who was particularly had a genius kind of a, perspective on things. So he says, basically, the following idea. The tefillah of a Balkari, there are really two issues. One is it an obligation? Is it something which is an impediment for tefillah and Talmud Torah. But basically, what is the idea behind the Tefila of Balkari? It represents a high standard, a personal orientation, which is not only admirable, but which, is impactful in who you are and what you're doing. The Gemara says in Brachos, the reason for Tefillah is Balkari. A Balkari is somebody who is frivolous, and that frivolity, that kalus rosh, is incompatible with Torah study and Tefillah. Tefillah is Amida Lefnei Melech, standing in the presence of the Rabbanu Shalom, literally. Ezu Avodah, Shabalev, Harezu Tefillah. And Tamatara comes from, the giving of the Torah in Har Sinai. And that was a time of Yira and Pachad and Zia that was, the mountain itself was shaking. Says the Gemara. So that's why there was a takana that, you have to neutralize the frivolity of Balkari with a tahara, with a tvila in a mikvah, in order to properly, cultivate, the kind of pachad and yira and appreciation for the importance of tefillah and Talmud Torah. Says Yavnei Nezer, maybe it's that minhag. If there's a minhag that dafka and Yom Kippur, you should be makpid for the din of Balkari, it's like halal on Rashkodesh. In other words, the obligation to do it is a minhag. It's not in the Talmud, it's not in the Nevi'im, right? But it's not an empty minhag. It's not a minhag which is limited in its meaning and significance. The minhag is to adopt higher standards of yira and pachad, right, on Yom Kippur in your learning and in your tefillah. And that's always a good thing. So maybe that warrants a bracha, in the same way that Halal and Rashkodesh warrants a bracha. Even if there's no chiyuv, there's a chiyuv. That is then he goes on to try to explain, well, if that's such a good argument, why did the Rosh disagree? And once he explains that, and why did Rab Sadra go and disagree with the disagreement, etc. Now, the Avnei Nezer mostly means this idea, this fascinating idea, in a limited way. He's saying, well, all year round, because of the, if you raise the standards too high, you exclude too many people. And we'd rather have more people involved in learning and in davening, even if it comes at the expense of the standards. But on Yom Kippur, you should raise those standards even more. On Yom Kippur, we can afford to raise the standards, or at least if we do, we can acknowledge the importance of it. I think it's a very fascinating idea. But I would like to take it a step further. And I'd like to suggest two things. Number one, that the role of Tefillah and Talmud Torah on Yom Kippur, it's not just Yom Kippur is one day of a year. Here we can employ the high standards. It's the idea that Yom Kippur as a day is a day which celebrates the Sinas HaTorah and Tefillah. And I want to take it one step further. The Yira and the Pachad and the Ema and the Charada, which is the reason for Tefillas Balkari to begin with, is also part and parcel of the very day of Yom Kippur itself. Let me explain each one very quickly. Yom Kippur is a day which celebrates Nesinas HaTorah. That's not so well known, but of course it's the day in which the Luchos Shnios, right, emerged. After the Shviras HaLuchos, and the Chet of the Egel HaZahav. It's not so well known, because while there were Kolos and Brakim, at the first, Maimed Har Sinai and giving of the Luchos, right? The second were Tznius. Rashi in his Perish al Torah, quoting Chazal, says, the first Luchos were given by Kolos Ubrakim, thunder and lightning, like a real, presentation. And that's also why they failed. The second were given a more tsanua way, and that's why they succeeded. Ein l'chayafa min hatznius. It's interesting because Yom Kippur is both a day of bombast. The Avodas Yom Kippurim is a remarkable spectacle, but it's also a day of tznius. It's a day where the Kohen Gadol enters l'fnai v'lifnim, and no one sees that. Either way, it's the day of luchos shnios. And as such, the same kind of yura pachad that accompanied the first, even more so, need to accompany the second bitzniusa. It shouldn't be an impression that because, it was quieter, somehow it was less significant. That's the long, enduring, luchos. And there's a lot of indication that Yom Kippur is a day of Tamatara, of Limud Torah, a kind of a Matan Torah. Equally, of course, Yom Kippur is a day of Tefila. It's the Yom HaTefila. That's why we have the extra Ne'ilah. The focus is on the Beis HaMikdash, Kivesi, Beis Yikarei L'chol Ho'am, Kivesi Beis Tefila Yikarei L'chol Ho'amim. There's even a practice to stay in shul all day and all night, the Beis HaKnesses, on Yom Kippur. There's a practice to sleep in the Beis HaKnesses, or at least stay up all night in the Beis HaKnesses on Yom Kippur. Or even shilas about, how you do that appropriately. Like, are you allowed to sleep in the presence of the Aron Kodesh? And, is it, bizoyon? This focus on Kibesi Beis Tefila Yikarei L'chol Ho'amim, on the day when the Beis HaMikdash was centermost, by means of the avoda, and this idea of a day of absolute tefillah lifnei Hashem is clear. Already Aseret Yemei Teshuva, all the additions, the changes in tefillah that we have, point to this tkufa, beginning with Rosh Hashanah, but culminating, achieving its, again, apex in Yom Kippur, as an extraordinary Yom of Amida Lifnei Hashem, a Yom Tefila. The Torah uses the expression Mikra Kodesh in Parshas Emor ubiquitously, but only with regard to Yom Kippur is it used also with regard to the specifics of the day. In other words, typically Mikra Kodesh refers to the Isur Malacha that is generic to all Yomim Tovim. But on Yom Kippur, the Mikra Kodesh is connected to V'nisam es nafshosechem and to the Isur Malacha on Yom Kippur itself. Chazal say, and the Ramban elaborates this in Parshas Emor, that one of the meanings of Mikra Kodesh is the idea of Tefila and Tamatara. So we're being told, in a way, that the Mikra Kodesh of Yom Kippur is more intense, it's more specific to its day. It's not just the generic Regalim one or the generic Yom Moedim one. So the idea that there is an added sensitivity, right, to the pachad and yira that is required, by tefillah and by Talmud Torah, is very sensible. The Ramban is of the opinion that the only time tefillah is daraisa, the only time tefillah is min Torah, is in a yom tzara. There's some sort of crisis. And the Rambam disagrees. But I once heard the Rav suggest that the Yom Noraim are a time of crisis. A very interesting raya for it. I mean, the whole discussion in the poskim, whether you say slichos, even on Shabbos of Aseret Yemei Teshuva. Our practice is not to do that. But the Beis Yosef quotes poskim who did it, and he explains that they felt it was like Yom Noraim are like, ear shamukaf, oivim. It's like you're being sieged, right? You feel this sense of helplessness or danger. Rabbeinu Bechai speaks about Hayom Haras Olam of Rosh Hashanah already as a day of fear, a day of pachad. So it's like giving birth, but giving birth mostly like in the old days. You don't know whether you're going to live through it. It could be great joy, or there could be great tragedy. It's Hayom Haras Olam. It's the day of pachad and yira. Rabbeinu Bechai and the Ramban, who he's really following the Ramban and expanding it, says all of Aseret Yemei Teshuva are Yemei Pachad. Of course, the Rambam said this in a different way much earlier. So it isn't just the Tefila of these Yamim, in the Eis Tzara, and the fact that we changed the Nusach HaTefila, both during Aseret Yemei Teshuva, and even part of the core structure, Kela Kadosh, Melech HaKadosh, insertions and bakashos, in the last parts of Shmoneh Esrei, which typically are not allowed. All these changes that it's as a tshuva, in which he says, piyutim, all the rules change on Aseret Yemei Teshuva because they're Yemei Tefila. If indeed it's Yemei Tefila, and especially Yemei Tefila Shal Pachad, Shal Tzaros, then the idea that Tfilas carry, or that negating, Kalus Rosh, that accentuating that sense of not terror, but of seriousness, of the high stakes, that becomes a factor in maybe even making a bracha, according to Reb Saadia Gaon, on this particular tefillah. I say, go even further. Forget, it's because of, it's connected to the tefillah and the Tamatara, certainly, but let's take it a step further. The Rambam explains that the reason that we know there's no halal on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But the Gemara says that explicitly in Rosh Hashanah and in Erchin, right? Kodesh Baruch Hu is sitting on Kisei Hadin, right? And Vatem Omrim Shira. So there's no halal on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But the Rambam's take on that, in Hilchos Chanukah, I have it here on the sheets. If you look on, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to be able to go through everything, but the last entry, Rambam talks about the obligation of halal. Shmona Asar Yom b'shana mitzvah ligmar ben sahalo Elohim. Shmoni me'achag, Shmoni me'chanukah, Rishon shel Pesach, Yom Hatzeres. Aval Rosh Hashanah v'Yom Kippurim ein b'hem halal, she'ein Yemei Teshuva v'yira v'fachad, v'lo Yemei Simchas Yisera. As days of yira v'fachad, halal is inappropriate. And maybe for that reason, even if there's no din of Tfilas Keri, Shol Kol Shana, right? The pachad and the yira that is required on Yom Kippur, right, require it of us, or at least make the tefillah into a kiyum, even one which, according to Reb Saadia Gaon, requires a bracha. But let's take it a step further, since my time is almost up. So let me talk about one other aspect. I think if there's another reason, possibly for the bracha of tefillah in advance of Yom Kippur. And that is based, again, on the unique status of Yom Kippur itself as a day of Tahara. It's only with regard to Yom Kippur, of all the Moedim, that the Torah formulates Tahara as a central motif. If you go back to page 1, the pasuk Ki Bayom Hazeh in Parshas Acharei Mos, when Torah wants to explain what's unique about Yom Kippur, Ki Bayom Hazeh Yechaper Aleichem L'taher Eschem B'kol Chatosechem L'fnei Hashem Titaharu. Because this is the day of kapara, to become tahar, to be tahar in the presence of the Ribbono Shel Olam. Again, it comes trippingly off our tongues because, we know the psukim. It's very prominent. It's the, essentially it's the formulation of Kedushas Hayom in the Tefilas of Yom Kippur. Therefore, we're all familiar with the pasuk. Therefore, sometimes we neglect to stand back and to appreciate, just how unusual it is. What does it mean, right? That it is a day l'taher eschem mikol chatosechem. Tahara and chet are not typically associated. Usually it's kapara from chet, and we have that. Ki b'yom hazeh yichaper alechem. It's Yom HaKippurim. Where does the tahara come into play? And of course, the last Mishnah in Yoma, famous formulation of Rabbi Akiva, Omer Rabbi Akiva, Ashreichem Yisrael, the next Marmakom, right in the beginning here, right? Ashreichem Yisrael ifnei mi atem metaharin, a double tahara formulation, right? In the presence of who do you become tahar? And me mitaher eschem, who actively promotes your tahara. There's a lot of, discussion about why you need this double formulation. Lifnei mi atem metaharim and mi mitaher eschem, avichem shabashamai. Shenemar, v'zarakti aleichem, mayim tahorim v'tahartem, v'omer mikveh Yisrael, ma mikveh metaharis hatmeim, av HaKadosh Baruch Hu, metaher es Yisrael. All these expressions of tahara, when it comes to Yom Kippur, are fascinating. And they're particularly reinforced by the very famous view of the Rabbeinu Yonah. Rabbeinu Yonah, if you look on page 2, it says Sefer Shari Tshuva Rabbeinu Yonah Shar Dalet. Towards the bottom of the page, Rabbeinu Yonah, I'll tell you what he says first and then I'll read it, formulates that there is an independent special obligation of tshuva that applies specifically on Yom Kippur, in addition to the obligation of tshuva kol shana, all year round. And what is that based on? It's based on the pasuk Lifnei Hashem Titaharu. So if you look here, the Rosh says, Al Zeh Shomer Avosenu Zecharnu Livracha, Kal Krisus Mises Bezin Teshuva Yom Kippurim Tolim Yisur Memarkim. Okay, the impact of various forces on neutralizing your kapara, creating kapara. Yesh she'ela. Halo katuv mikol chatosechem b'fnei Hashem titaru. Torah says mikol chatosechem. Yom Kippur is going to be neutralizing all chatos. V'atshuva bazeh. Ki ma shenemar lifnei Hashem titaru. When the Torah says lifnei Hashem titaru, it's not saying that it will. It's saying you are obligated to do tshuva on all your sins. It's not saying it's not an antidote. It's an imperative. Very, very mechudash interpretation of Rabbeinu Yonah. Lifnei Hashem, ma shenemar lifnei Hashem titaru mitzvahs aseh al tshuva, shenechapes darkeinu, v'nachkora v'nashuva al Hashem. We should do introspection. We should turn to the Ribbono Shel Olam b'Yom Kippurim. The Afal Pishan is chayavnu al zeh b'chol eis, even though we're obligated all times. Hachiyuv nosaf b'Yom Kippurim is an additional obligation on Yom Kippur. V'tahara asher b'yadeinu hi hatshuva v'tikun ha'maaseh. The tahara that we speak of is a certain kind of tshuva and tikun ha'maaseh. Aval masha kosav ki b'yom hazeh yichaper alechem l'taher eschem shehu amur al tahara sheHashem yisbarach metaher osanu min avon u'mechaper aleinu kapara shlema b'yom kippurim below yisurim So then Nemra mitzvah slow sase. Allah krisus and misas bezin Teshuva Yom Kippur and tolim bisur mimarkim. He says there are two references to tahara in the pasuk. One is the Rabbanu Shalom applying tahara, and that applies to certain mitzvos. And then there's the obligation of Klal Yisrael to do tshuva lifnei Hashem to taharu. It's fascinating that when he explains elsewhere, Rabbi Yonah, earlier in Shar Beis, what should be the climate of Aseret Yemei Teshuva. So he says, the next piece, Hayare is Dvar Hashem. This fits in very nicely, and it's the transition between the two things that I'm trying to speak about, or the three or four, actually. Hayare is Dvar Hashem. Here he speaks about the climate of Pachad and Yira. A person who fears God's word, Libo Yachil Bikirbo, his heart will tremble. Bedato Shakol Masa B'Sefer Nechtavim. Once he realizes that, he's exposed in the eyes of the Rabbanu Shalom, there are no secrets. U'ba'esahi Elokim Yavi Mishpat es Kol Masel Kol Nelam Im Tovim Ra Ki Adam Nidom Rosh Hashanah Ugzardin Shalo Nechtam B'Yom Kippurim U'be'esa Sher Yeda Ha'Adam Ki Aviu Azino Lefnei Melech Basav Adam. If a person knows he's going on trial, in an earthly trial, Halo Yecharad Charada Gedola, won't he tremble? Right? Yom Kippur is supposed to be a day of Yirav Avachad. Confidence, but also Yirav Avachad. The Yashis Eitzos Benafsho, right? He'll start trying to figure out how he can, extricate himself from his dilemma. Ubechal Darke Charitzus Yachish Miflatlo. He'll try to find refuge. Certainly isn't going to ignore his impending trial and just go about business as usual. Right? The fatech l'shaded ad maso, v'leifana derech kramim, v'leisrapa biyom tzara me'achin leiv v'lehinatzel k'tzvi miyad. He's not going to just cultivate his field and worry about business when his life is at stake. L'chein mano alnu hayotzim lepa'alam v'avodasam adei erev v'yomim anaroi mimei adin v'amishpat beinam yodim ma yeh mishpatam. How shocking would it be that in advance of Yom Kippur, people don't pause, to reassess, where they are and what they need to do. Halal hagosam yeger libam biyom sheidu barbam manasa lachosenu biyom sheidu barbam v'roi lekol yirei elokim lemait basakav v'lios rayonav nechtem v'likvo biyom b'layla itim lizboded b'chadarav. Person should be introspecting. He should be isolating himself, not because of the pandemic, but as a way of focusing on who he is. Trying to figure out a way, right, to reform and refine himself, and how to, daven properly, formulate his tefillos, Belases tefila verina, belahapil tchina, ba'eses ratzon va'tefila nishmaspo. Kinyan shenemar be'es ratzon anisicha, u'biyom Yeshua azarticha. Amro senu levracha zakron levracha dirshua Hashem behimatzo elo asar yamim sheven Rosh Hashanah liyom Kippur. U'mitzvahs asay min Torah. It's a positive commandment. Laha'ir adam asrucho, to stir yourself. Lachsor b'tshuva b'yom Kippurim. Shenemar mikol chatosechem lifnei Hashem tetaru. Like he says later on. Al kain hiziranu akasuv shenitayr lifnei Hashem b'tshuvasenu u'ichaper aleinu b'yom hazeh l'taher osanu. Meaning, what Rabbi Yonah is saying here is the two last aspects that we're speaking of. Number one, our approach to Yom Kippur shouldn't be frivolous. Again, it shouldn't be panic-ridden either, but it should be characterized by serious introspection, by hard work, and by, healthy terror, if you will, healthy concern, healthy worry. They're Yemei Pachad V'Yira. Again, I always like to invoke the language of the Rambam. I quoted before the Rambam in Chanukah, where he says that there's no Halal because of Ein B'hem Yira, because of Yemei Yira V'Fachad. In Pirush Mishnayos, his language is more powerful, in my opinion. He says, these are days of Yira V'Fachad Mimenu, U'Mivrach, U'Manos Elav. The point is not to fear the Rabbanu Shalom and therefore to run away, but to seek refuge because of your fear, right? Yira V'Fachad Mimenu, U'Mivrach, U'Manos Elav. So therefore, there's a kiyum in promoting, in neutralizing Kalas Rosh and in promoting, COVID Rosh or Yira and Pachad. And at the same time, going further than that, when the Torah says that there's an obligation of Tahara and that Yom Kippur is a time of Tahara, that's a different kind of a tshuva. What characterizes the special tshuva of Tahara, particularly, and especially the paradigm of Mikveh Yisrael? Again, it goes back to the very first theme that we developed, the theme of Gerus and of transformation. And the idea that on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, in addition to, the focus on individual chatayim, there is especially the refashioning, the refining, in some cases, the transformation of the religious personality himself, right? A remake takes place because you have to relate not only to one sin at a time, right, but to the totality of who you are and what you stand for, and what is meaningful about and purposeful about your existence. In that sense, it's Mikveh Yisrael. As we know, the methodology of Tahara b'mikvah requires that everything at once be immersed. If even your little finger is above the water, you can't do piecemeal Tahara b'mikvah. It needs comprehensiveness, and it needs a holistic approach. So Rabbeinu Yonah says, Yom Kippur kibbeh yom hazeh yichaper alechem l'taher eschem lifnei Hashem titaru. That's the tshuva of Tahara. I'm just adding Mikveh Yisrael, right? Lifnei mi atem mitaharim u'mi mitaher eschem. The answer is a holistic, comprehensive tshuva, one which impacts your very personality. So my time's come to an end, so I just want to recap for a moment. We began with this well-known minhag of Tefila on Erev Yom Kippur, which clearly is something, a matter of debate, doesn't appear in the Rambam. I should add one other makar. That's the Rishalmi says, if you're going to be careful about Tahara in Achila, then the days to do it are Aseret Yemei Teshuva. That's what Rishalmi seems to say. Again, this theme of Tahara emerges very prominently. But going back, there is a view, some are very makbid, that there should be Tefila on Erev Yom Kippur. The question is, what is the basis of it? Reb Saadia Gaon goes further and suggests there's even a bracha. The Rosh argues, halacha, we certainly don't, even those who do it do not make a bracha. But we're trying to understand what is the basis of this minhag, and why would Reb Saadia Gaon, apply, even a bracha to it. And what we tried to develop is that Yom Kippur is a singular day in every way, and that some of its themes are particularly conducive to the concept of Tahara and Tefila. The first one being the idea of imitating Malachim, the idea that we can compete and therefore we can defeat Malachim, because the flaw of humanity its challenges, are also its strength. When we can harness, the aspirations of Malachim, with the with the challenges of, and also the strengths, of humanity. And that according to the Rosh and others, this idea of being Nikiyim Kamalachim, and this general idea of, imitating Malach on Yom Kippur is a very important theme. From there, we went to discuss the perspective of the Darkei Moshe, or quoted in Darkei Moshe, the idea that this is a kind of Tevilas Gerus. And again, especially based on the idea that in general in Teshuva there is an aspect of transformation, but that is particularly conducive, as we were trying to explain, to the Teshuva of Rosh Hashanah and especially of Yom Kippur, as it's brought about by the calendar and it's motivated by the relationship, not so much engendered by, particular action or particular transgression. Therefore, the paradigm of ger shenizgayer kekatan shenoladami eni osa isha asa osa mamasim in the Rambam's Darkei Teshuva is something which is even more pronounced for the Teshuva of Yom Kippur. We went on from there to suggest a third idea, and that is that it really is based on the principle of Balkari, but based on the fascinating suggestion of the Avnei Nezer, which is that even though there's no Tfilas Keri Bisman Hazeh, right, there's a kiyum in Tfilas Keri, in that it highlights a higher standard of yira and pachad and respect when it comes to Tefila and Tamatara. And if that isn't obligatory all year round, and it's not ma'akev, it still might be a mitzvah or a kiyum enough to even inspire a bracha on Yom Kippur. And here I was trying to suggest that, in addition to Yom Kippur being a fine day to manifest to this, idea, it's also true that there's a special bond, special connection between Yom Kippur and Talmud Torah and the giving of the second luchos, as well as, even more so maybe, the idea of Yom Kippur as a day of Tefila. And as such, there's even more reason to apply the principle of the Avnei Nezer, and maybe even going further than that Yom Kippur is a day of Yira of Afachad, as manifest also in various different ways, is something which is conducive even more so to neutralizing Kalos Rosh and, promoting, what Tefilas Balkari accomplishes. And then finally suggesting that if you look at the psukim and the halachic treatment and agaitic treatment of Yom Kippur, we find that the role of tahara is particularly prominent. And according to Rabbeinu Yonah especially, where Lifnei Hashem Titaru is an obligation of an independent tshuva, and especially if that is a different kind of tshuva, which is also more holistic, and as Rabbeinu Yonah indicates, is connected with the Yira and the Pachad, that kind of brings together of Tefila and other things, many of the themes that we have been discussing. In the end of the day, whether one is tovel or not, certainly la halacha, you shouldn't make a bracha, there should be a greater appreciation for the uniqueness of the day of Yom Kippur as a day of Tahara, and is really a day which idealizes our potential and our relationship with the Ribono Shel Olam, as long as we apply these various themes, we think about them seriously, and we apply them in our lives. So I want to wish everybody a Gemar Chasima Tova and a Shnas Chaim Shalom. Again, it's really a very difficult year for everybody, individuals and Klal Yisrael and the world. And we should all be mispalel that we should all see better times. Hopefully that's already beginning to happen. And, everybody who needs refuah shlema should get one. And our tefillos should be effective as an expression also of Lifnei Hashem Titaru. And so I wish everybody a good Yontif. I think we're resuming on October 5th, Tuesday, October 5th at 7:30 with Masachet Bava Basra, Parak Rishon. If there are a few questions, I can stay for a couple of minutes. I leave it to the chair.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosensweig, once again for presenting a shiur in honor of the upcoming holidays. It always enhances enriches our experience, our holiday experience. And we want to thank you and wish you a Gemar Chasim Tova, a good ben shiur, and please God, may all our tefillos be answered l'tova this coming year. Everyone should have a good evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Gemara Chasim Tova. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.